There are voices that leave long after they're gone. Welcome to a tribute from Hollywood, a place where we honor American stars we've recently lost and pay tribute to remarkable figures from across the world. If these stories resonate with you, your support keeps these tributes alive and reaching new audiences. Joni Lamb never seemed to be chasing stardom. That quality was always what set her apart. For the millions of Americans who tuned into Christian television throughout the 1980s, 90s, and the early cable era, her presence became something deeply familiar, not showy, not polished the way primetime television was, just steady. Recognizable. Even comforting. Her passing at 65 has hit close to home for people who watched Daystar almost daily. In the years before massive digital platforms took over faith-based media, before religious programming became a high-budget industry, Joni and Marcus Lamb built something that landed right in American living rooms, especially throughout Texas and the South, where faith and family television often shared the same evening hours. Her family announced her passing in Texas, the state where her life and her work remained deeply rooted even as the network expanded dramatically over the decades. What often goes unmentioned is how demanding that world was behind the scenes: long days, fundraising stress, relentless criticism, and still she showed up. Steady smile. Gentle voice. Sometimes visibly tired, honestly, visibly human. That meant more than any polished performance could. Those who are old enough probably remember when televangelists filled entire cable afternoons. Some imploded under scandal. Some grew into cultural giants. Joni always felt more real than that, more like the kind of person you might actually run into at a church in Fort Worth or Dallas. And now another face from that chapter has quietly gone, which carries its own particular sadness. Because slowly, one by one, the voices that once filled American homes as daily constants are becoming something we only remember. When news came that Michael Tilson Thomas had died, something shifted for people who had spent years believing orchestral music was meant for grand halls in faraway cities. He was 81. The announcement arrived without drama, understated, the way he himself moved through life in his later years. For decades he stood before orchestras with unmistakable presence, sometimes already smiling before the first note fell. Audiences who caught PBS broadcasts in the 70s and 80s never forgot him. Neither did the crowds who packed San Francisco's Symphony Hall after he transformed that institution into something more open, more vibrant, more welcoming. He made serious music feel genuinely alive. He could talk about Mahler in one breath and joke easily with young players in the next. Never stiff. Never locked inside the old image of the distant maestro. People who knew him described someone endlessly curious, still deep in conversation after midnight rehearsals, still talking about jazz, Bernstein, Broadway, old recordings nobody else remembered. Music wasn't what he did. It was how he thought. His relationship with Leonard Bernstein cast a long shadow over an entire generation of conductors. You could hear it in how he led, that rare pairing of intellectual rigor and real emotion, precision alongside heart. And now another voice from that era is silent. One more familiar face bound to evenings at the piano, public television concerts, vinyl spinning slowly in quiet rooms. Time keeps arriving faster than anyone planned. Sinead O'Connor was only 56 when the news broke. For people who came of age during the late 80s and early 90s, it landed somewhere deep. Not only because of the music, because of the rawness, the pain she never tried to cover up. Her family confirmed the loss and almost immediately people returned to old recordings, especially that voice. Delicate one moment, then overwhelming the next. When Nothing Compares to You appeared on television in 1990, it stopped the room. No elaborate staging, just a young woman in close-up, carrying grief in every feature of her face. Those tears at the end are still talked about today. But long before that, the lion and the cobra had already made clear she was something different, fierce, restless, unwilling to move through the music industry on anyone else's terms. She shaved her head when record executives pushed her toward a more marketable look. At the time, it seemed shocking. Looking back, it reads as defiance and courage. She paid dearly for speaking too freely, about religion, about abuse, about politics, about her own mental health. Some wrote her off for it. Others never stopped respecting her for exactly that reason. There was always something painfully real about Sinead. You could feel it even in the silence between words. Another unmistakable voice from that era is gone now. Another reminder of how quickly the faces from our record collections, our late-night radios, our younger lives, quietly turn into memory. Before the cowboy hat became iconic. Before the sold-out tours and the dry, sharp charisma he carried into every room, Dwight Yoakam was just a quiet kid from Kentucky trying to figure out why he never quite fit. He was born October 23, 1956 in Pikeville, hard country, cold country, the kind of place where men worked until their bodies gave out and women learned early how to carry loss without making much of it. His father ran a gas station. His mother loved music, and that mattered in ways people didn't fully appreciate until later. Long before Dwight ever stood under stage lights, he was listening. Buck Owens. Hank Williams. Johnny Cash. Voices soaked in loneliness, not the polished kind, the real kind, worn down and honest. Maybe that's why audiences believed him later. The family eventually relocated to Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous, not exciting, just another American city where a kid who didn't fit the mold could easily disappear. And Dwight didn't fit. Too country for some. Too unusual for others. Even in school there was always a sense that he was watching life from just outside the circle. He did theater, played music, tried on different versions of himself without landing in any of them. Years later that restlessness would become his entire public image. Back then it mostly looked like not knowing where he belonged. By the late 70s, Nashville wanted everything smooth, clean-cut singers, polished voices, easy radio sounds. Dwight wasn't any of those things. His voice caught in unexpected places. He sounded older than his years, sadder too. Label after label passed. So he left. That choice changed his life. In the early 1980s he moved to Los Angeles, which struck most people as almost absurd. A committed honky-tonk singer trying to survive in the middle of punk clubs and Hollywood excess. But somehow that's exactly where he found his footing. He played small venues around LA while punk bands lit up rooms nearby. Nobody expected a lean guy in tight jeans singing old-school country to survive that scene. But people noticed something right away. He meant it. Even young, especially young, there was real pain underneath the performance. And unlike many artists who spend years constructing a persona, Dwight Yoakam already seemed to carry a complicated past before fame even arrived. That's what made people go quiet when he sang. Not technical skill, recognition. Women especially seemed to understand something in him. Maybe because he never pretended to be untouchable. Even at his coolest there was always something slightly wounded, something searching. By 1986, when guitars, Cadillacs, etc., broke through, America wasn't just discovering a singer, they were meeting a man who had spent most of his life feeling like he belonged nowhere and had suddenly found something like home. For a stretch of time in this country, Dwight Yoakam was simply everywhere. You'd hear him in diners, on highway radio, coming from somewhere down a street. By the late 80s his voice had become part of the emotional fabric of American life. 1,000 miles from nowhere. Fast as You. Little Sister. Honky-tonk man songs that felt alive, imperfect in exactly the right ways. What separated him from most country stars of that period was that fame never seemed to fully settle on him comfortably. Even at the peak of his popularity, there was always a distance, as if part of him stayed just behind the sunglasses and the wry half-smile. Women noticed that, especially those who had been around long enough to recognize loneliness when it showed itself. By 1988 he was moving millions of records, touring relentlessly, collecting awards. The boy from Kentucky who couldn't get a deal in Nashville was now rewriting what country music could sound like, from outside Nashville entirely. That mattered more than people grasped at the time. He dragged rawness back into a genre that had been slowly sanitizing itself. Not scandal, but emotional danger, heartbreak that actually sounded believable. His personal life became harder to pin down as the career climbed. Actresses, models, rumored relationships. A constant surrounding noise. But even surrounded by people, something about him remained solitary, private in a way that couldn't be explained away. Then came Sling Blade in 1996. The performance was dark and unsettling, nothing like what audiences thought they knew about him. And he was genuinely, unmistakably good. Not in the way celebrities can be good. Actually good. It revealed something important. Dwight Yoakam understood damaged men because some part of him had always been one. As the years moved into the late 90s and early 2000s, country music shifted around him. Younger voices arrived. Radio moved faster and louder. Artists built on atmosphere and emotional texture, artists like Dwight, started to feel slightly out of step. That kind of drift hurts more than fans realize, because performers who gave everything to an art form often experience fading cultural relevance as something closer to grief. He never publicly collapsed. No tabloid breakdown, no dramatic fall. But there were signs. Longer silences, fewer public appearances, a growing wall around his private life. Underneath everything was a man aging in front of an audience that still held a younger version of him in their minds. That's a specific kind of weight to carry, especially for someone who built a career projecting emotional toughness while quietly carrying sadness the whole time. Something in Dwight Yoakam shifted as the years quieted down around him, not sharply, but gradually. The sharpness was still there when he wanted it. But by the 2010s there was less urgency, less need to chase or prove anything to an audience that had already made up their minds about him long ago. Honestly, that seemed like health. For years he had lived like a man constantly staying just ahead of loneliness, recording, touring, reinventing, always moving before anything could catch him. But age changes performers in ways that go past the physical. Applause, you eventually realize, offers no real shelter from grief or isolation or time. He hinted at regret in occasional interviews, never naming it directly. Relationships that didn't last. Years spent working instead of building anything stable and quiet. The hollow feeling that can follow standing in front of thousands of people night after night. Then came something nobody expected. In 2020, at 63, Dwight married Emily Joyce. Quietly, privately. During a year when the entire world felt fragile and strange, longtime fans found the news unexpectedly moving. Because after decades of seeming emotionally rootless, he finally looked like someone who had chosen to stay still. And maybe that had always been the real destination. Not fame, not survival, just peace. He performs less often now. But when he does walk onto a stage, audiences react with something that goes beyond nostalgia. It's closer to memory made physical. For women who spent decades listening to him, Dwight Yoakam represents something modern celebrity rarely offers anymore. Mystery. Not the manufactured kind. Human mystery. The kind that never fully explains itself. There's something almost surreal about watching him now. Not because he changed, because the world did. The America that first welcomed him has largely disappeared. Record stores are gone. Late-night country radio faded. The generation that slow danced to his songs in kitchens and living rooms has grown older, quieter, more reflective. And somehow Dwight aged alongside them without ever fully surrendering the version of himself they first fell for. That matters, especially to women who spent years carrying families, heartbreak, marriages, losses, funerals, and a handful of brief moments that felt like joy. Because artists like him were never just background sound. They became emotional markers for entire stretches of life. One song recalls a first love. Another, a long drive after a painful goodbye. Another, someone who isn't here anymore. That kind of connection doesn't fade with years. It deepens. Even now, when he steps onto a stage, there's still something hesitant in him. Still mysterious. Still that low, quiet sadness he arrived with and never put down. Maybe that's why people never stopped believing him. Because Dwight Yoakam never performed like a man claiming life was manageable. He sounded like someone who had simply gotten through it. At this point in his life, that may be worth more than anything fame ever gave him. Jonathan Tiersten had one of those faces you remembered without always being able to name. When news broke that he had passed away at 60, longtime horror fans felt something shift quietly, another piece of independent cinema history slipping away. His family confirmed the loss following his passing in New Jersey. He was never a Hollywood name in the conventional sense, and he never tried to be. That was a big part of why people liked him. For many viewers, Jonathan will always live inside the strange, unsettling energy of low-budget horror from the late 80s and 90s, Sleepaway Camp especially. That film survived through midnight screenings, VHS rentals, convention halls, word of mouth passed between teenagers sitting too close to televisions long after midnight. And there he was, young, awkward, real. But music ran just as deep for him, maybe deeper. He spent years fronting rock bands, writing songs, playing for smaller rooms where the people in the crowd knew every word. There's something genuinely admirable about artists who keep creating without ever chasing a larger spotlight. He seemed built that way. People who encountered him at horror conventions consistently said the same things afterward: warm, funny, approachable, no pretension. That feels increasingly rare now. The actors and musicians tied to that era of cult cinema are leaving one by one. The video stores are long gone. The late-night cable marathons, too. And yet somehow those performances survive, frozen in time, while the people behind them slowly become part of someone else's memories. Little Richard did not enter American music quietly. He detonated into it. Enormous voice. Relentless piano. Hair towering. Energy that felt almost too dangerous for the 1950s to contain. For people who grew up in that era, hearing Tutti Frutti or Long Tall Sally for the first time felt like the country had suddenly shifted into a higher gear overnight. His death at 87 closed out the story of one of the true builders of rock and roll, not just a star from the early days, but one of the actual architects of a sound that changed American culture permanently. The loss was confirmed by family following years in which his health had grown increasingly fragile, though somehow many fans never quite stopped imagining Little Richard as unstoppable, because he always sounded that way. Kids who came of age in the 50s and 60s understood what he meant back then. Freedom. Noise. Movement. Parents often couldn't stand it. Too wild, too fast, too much, and that was precisely the point. What sometimes gets lost now is how completely foundational he was to almost everyone who followed. Elvis admired him. The Beatles studied him. Prince clearly absorbed that fearless stage electricity and carried it decades forward. Even when others built bigger commercial careers, the music world understood something quietly: Little Richard opened the door first. His life was complicated too: faith, identity, struggles with fame, long stretches of loneliness. He spoke openly at times, then pulled back. Contradictions trailed him for decades. Human contradictions. And honestly, that complexity may be exactly why people still connect with him. Because underneath all the screaming vocals and pounding piano was a man who spent his entire life trying to reconcile who he was with the world looking back at him. Few artists ever carried that tension more openly. Fewer still changed American music more completely.